The land lay in a hush of dying light, the sky poured out in bruised purples and fading golds, as though the day itself were reluctant to surrender. Silas Boone stood at the edge of his pasture, one hand on the worn fence rail, his face turned toward the endless stretch of prairie that seemed to swallow both hope and memory. A widower at 36, he had learned to carry silence like a second skin, every wrinkle on his face etched by the sun and grief. The cattle moved slowly in the field, dark shapes in the dusk, and he was thinking of nothing at all, until he saw them. At first it was only dust. A tremor on the horizon, as though the earth itself exhaled. Then came silhouettes, 3 of them, rising tall against the rim of the sunset. They moved with a strange certainty, not hurried, not hesitant, but steady, like trees walking, like shadows with weight. His breath caught. He had heard whispers in town, stories told in half-mocking, half-fearful voices, of 3 women too large for the world, outcasts who wandered together. Now here they were, crossing his land as if the prairie had guided them to his door. The first to step into the clearing was a woman with long dark hair bound in a braid thick as a rope. Her shoulders were broad, her stride unyielding, but her eyes held something gentler, like the hush before a hymn. This was Tallulah Redbird. Beside her, with pale hair catching the last of the sun, came Mercy Quinn, taller still, her hands raw and calloused, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. And last, half a step behind, moved Haven Black Elk, quiet as dusk itself, her presence the kind that filled space without demanding notice. They stopped before Silas's fence, their shadows stretching long across the dirt. The evening had fallen so still he could hear the creak of the boards, the soft grind of leather boots against dry earth. He felt a ripple of unease. 3 women, each towering near a head above him, carried the air of something both sorrowful and formidable. He opened his mouth to demand what business they had on his land, but it was Mercy who spoke first. "We will have your baby." The words, plain and steady, struck him like a thrown stone. His hand tightened on the rail. For a moment he thought he had misheard, that the wind had carried some strange echo. But their faces told him otherwise, serious, unsmiling, as if they had rehearsed this vow beneath the endless sky. Silas let out a short, harsh laugh meant to cover his confusion. "You'll do no such thing. You'll turn right back the way you came." His voice cracked with more fear than anger, and he hated that they could hear it. Tallulah lifted her chin. "We're not beggars, rancher. Nor are we thieves. But we've been told since girlhood that we were too much for this world, too tall, too broad, too strange. Men look away, mothers hide their children. We came not for your pity, but because we heard of a man who lived alone and had lost all but his work." Her words slid beneath his defenses, yet he bristled. "So you think I'll give you a place here? That I'll invite ridicule, let the whole town laugh at Boone taking in the giants? No. I've carried enough shame without inviting more." Haven's gaze lingered on him, unblinking. "You carry shame already," she murmured. "But it's not ours you fear. It's your own." That truth stung deeper than he wished to admit. He felt his jaw clench, his chest knot tight. He remembered the laughter in town when his ranch faltered after his wife's death, the whispered bets on how long before he'd sell. To harbor these women would be to give the gossips fresh fuel. "I've no need for you," he said flatly. "Whatever life you seek, it's not here." For a long moment none of them moved. Then Mercy nodded once, as though she had expected nothing else. Without another word, they stepped away from the fence, their long shadows melting into the dim. Silas watched until the night swallowed them. Relief should have come, but instead he felt a hollow ache, as though he had turned away not strangers, but something half-promised. He slept poorly that night, his dreams restless with images of tall figures striding across stormlit fields. By morning he told himself it was finished. Yet when he rode out to the far corral, he found the broken gate mended. The work was rough but strong. A small pile of berries lay neatly on his porch rail, dew still clinging to their skins. He cursed under his breath, unwilling to admit gratitude. The day wore on with an unshakable tension, his eyes darting to the horizon as though expecting them to return. At dusk, a storm gathered. Dark clouds boiled across the plains, the wind bending grass flat. His cattle scattered in panic, bawling, pushing against the fence. And there, beyond the corral, he saw them again. The three women moved among the frightened herd, their massive forms a wall against the driving rain. Mercy spread her arms wide, guiding strays back toward shelter. Tallulah pressed her body against the weakest section of fence, holding it upright against the storm's fury. Haven, hair soaked to her back, caught a calf with bare hands and lifted it clear of the flood-churned mud. They worked with a wordless precision, as though they had always belonged to the land. Silas stood frozen on the porch, lantern light flickering against the rain. He felt the storm batter not only his ranch but the walls of his own stubborn heart. Pride told him to stay put, to let them prove themselves or perish. But something deeper, quieter, rose within him, a stirring he had not known since before loss hollowed him out. When the rain eased and the cattle settled, the women stood soaked and silent in the churned earth, their breath rising in steam. Silas stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into mud, and for the first time since his wife's death, he let words slip past the barricade of his loneliness. "You can sleep in the barn tonight." He did not wait for their reply. Turning back toward the glow of his lantern, he carried inside a heart unsettled and uncertain, yet undeniably changed. And though the storm had passed, he knew another was only beginning to gather inside him. Dawn came muted, pale light dripping through a sky still heavy with storm. Silas rose to the smell of wet earth and the faint, steady rhythm of someone moving in the barn. He stepped outside, boots sinking into softened ground, and paused at the sight before him. Tallulah stood by the horses, her enormous hands brushing them with surprising tenderness. Mercy knelt near the workbench, mending his torn harness with a patient precision. Haven leaned against a beam, quiet as a shadow, watching a bird pick at the rafters. They had taken his offer not as charity but as duty, already folding themselves into the work of the ranch. For a man who had lived by silence, the presence of these women was unsettling, yet he found himself waiting each day for their sounds, the scrape of boots, the hum of a lullaby, the low rumble of laughter. He offered no words of welcome, only the occasional mug of coffee left on a step, or a nod when passing. Still, something invisible grew between them, slow as grass after drought. But the town did not forgive quietly. By the third week, whispers began to stir at the general store. Silas heard them while he filled his sack with grain. "Boone's keeping the giants," one man sneered. "A lonely fool with no shame." Another chuckled, "He won't last the winter, those women will eat him out of house and home. Or crush him in his bed." The words clawed at his pride. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitened against the counter. He wanted to lash out, to shout them down, but he said nothing. Silence had always been his armor. Yet as he walked home beneath a sky whitening with heat, he felt the words gnaw like worms through wood. When he reached the ranch, ready to push them away for good, he found all three bent low in the dirt, planting rows of seed in the barren patch behind his house. Their massive hands worked carefully, gently pressing each kernel into the earth as though tending something sacred. They looked up at him, not expecting gratitude. Not asking permission, simply offering what hope they had. The sharp retort he had carried back from town died on his tongue. He turned away, ashamed of his weakness, though he knew the shame was not theirs but his own. That evening, as the horizon bled into crimson, riders appeared, 6 men, torches in hand, their laughter coarse and ugly. The cattle shied at their noise. Silas stepped from the porch, heart thudding like a hammer. He recognized them, men from town, swollen with liquor and cruelty. The leader, a heavy man with a scar down his cheek, called out, "Boone, send your monsters out. The plains don't need their kind. We'll drive them off if you won't." The women emerged from the barn, silent, their eyes steady in the torchlight. The men jeered, spitting words sharp as stones. Look at the size of M. Ain't natural. God's mistake walking on two legs. Another laughed. Boone must be desperate indeed. For a breathless instant, Silas felt the old instinct rise: keep quiet, keep safe, let the storm pass. But then he looked at Tallulah, her braid dripping in the night air, Mercy's hands scarred from work yet steady, Haven's gaze calm and unflinching. He thought of the fence they held through the storm, the calf lifted from the mud, the seeds pressed into soil no one else believed in. And something broke open in him, something that had rusted shut since the day he buried his wife. He stepped down into the yard, standing between the riders and the women. His voice came low, trembling but resolute. You call them unnatural. I call them the only ones who've shown me what love looks like when the world had none left to give. The torches crackled in the stunned silence. The men shifted uneasily, sneers faltering. The scarred leader spat once into the dirt, muttered a curse, then turned his horse. One by one, they rode off into the darkness, their laughter dead, their bravado burned out. The prairie swallowed the sound of hooves, leaving only the chirr of crickets and the slow hiss of torches dying in the damp air. Silas turned back. The three women stood as still as statues, yet something had changed. No one spoke, but the night seemed softer, as though the ranch itself had drawn a breath of relief. He felt their eyes on him, not demanding, not pleading, only steady, waiting for what he might choose next. Later, they sat together on the porch. The storm-battered land stretched wide before them, fireflies drifting like sparks shaken from the stars. Silas cradled a cup of coffee, its warmth seeping into hands that trembled more from release than fear. Beside him, Mercy mended his shirt in silence. Tallulah hummed a tune that seemed older than the plains. Haven watched the horizon as if she could see tomorrow rising. It was then Silas understood. When they had said, "We will have your baby," it was not a demand of flesh, not some bargain struck in desperation. It was a vow, to bear his hope when he had none, to carry his burdens, to stand with him against the emptiness. Perhaps one day children would come, perhaps not, but already the ranch felt less hollow, less haunted. Already he was not alone. The night deepened, and still they sat, for silhouettes bound not by blood but by a stubborn, quiet grace. Silas lifted his gaze to the sky, its stars sharp and countless, and felt the strange ache of a man who had been given back more than he had dared to ask. The laughter of the town, the shame of years, seemed smaller now, like distant thunder fading. And though no words were spoken, each of them knew the truth. Something had taken root in the soil of Boone's ranch, something strong enough to outlast drought, gossip, and the cruelty of men. It would grow slow, unseen at first, but it would grow. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and smoke. Silas closed his eyes, let it wash through him, and in that quiet moment he understood what it meant to begin again.